The tape smelled like her childhood. She never told anyone that. It was the kind of thing that would require too many follow-up questions, and Nadia Osei did not do follow-up questions. But every time she stood in the locker room before a fight, unspooling white athletic tape around her knuckles, left hand first, always left hand first, the smell hit her like a flat palm to the chest. Sharp, chemical, familiar in the way only things from childhood are familiar, which is to say, bone deep and slightly nauseating. She rapped in silence. The other fighters in the room were doing the things fighters do before a final match. Someone was hitting the wall with an open palm in a rhythm that meant nothing. Someone else was playing music through a single earbud, the other bud dangling, because you always keep one ear open. A woman in the corner was laughing too loud at something her coach said, laughing the way you laugh when you are about 14 seconds from throwing up from nerves, but you have decided that nerves are not a real thing that happens to you. Nadia rapped and watched and said nothing. She had been in this building before. Not this exact building. This one was in a different city, newer floors, the kind of lighting that made everyone look slightly green, but she had been in this building in every way that mattered. The smell, the sounds, the particular quality of quiet that existed just under all the noise, like a held breath. She had been coming to buildings like this since she was 9 years old, when her father would drive her in the back of his truck, the two of them sharing a silence that was not comfortable and was not uncomfortable, it was just theirs, and she would walk in with her bag over one shoulder and fight whoever they put in front of her, and then they would drive home and eat rice and he would say, "Good," and that was the whole of it. She tore the tape with her teeth, left hand done. She started on the right. Outside the locker room she could hear the crowd building, that particular low sound that a crowd makes when it has been sitting long enough to get restless, but not long enough to get bored. That rolling, shifting sound of 3,000 people adjusting in their seats and wanting something to happen. She had won 3 matches in the last 2 days to get to this final. The woman she was fighting today had won 4, which meant she had started the bracket earlier, which meant she was either extraordinarily good or the committee had misjudged the seedings, and Nadia had done enough research to know it was the former. She wasn't scared. She was something else, something that didn't have a clean name. It lived behind her sternum and pressed outward when she breathed. It had been there for about 11 months. She finished the right hand. She stood up, picked up her bag, walked to the door. She had already won. She just hadn't done the physical part yet. The match lasted 38 seconds. This is not an exaggeration made for dramatic effect. 38 seconds, which is less time than it takes to make a cup of instant coffee, less time than most people spend deciding which elevator button to press, less time than the announcer needed to finish reading her name and record into the microphone before the thing was over. Her opponent was good. She really was. The committee had read the seedings correctly. She was fast in a way that looked deceptively slow until it wasn't, and she came out with her hands high and her weight already loaded onto her back foot, the way fighters do when they have been taught by someone who understands geometry, and for about 4 of those 38 seconds, Nadia gave her the room she needed to show what she could do. Then she stopped giving her the room. What happened next would be replayed and broken down by 3 different combat sports channels in the following week. Footwork people would slow it down to frame by frame and argue about the angle. The argument would mostly be a way of saying, "We have never seen that before in a fight at this level," without admitting that they had never seen it before. Because admitting you haven't seen something is somehow shameful in spaces where expertise is the currency. The woman went down clean. No drama, like something simply being put away. The referee counted. It was done. They handed Nadia the belt, a wide, ridiculous thing with more gold on it than anything she had ever owned in her life, heavy in the way objects are heavy when they represent an unreasonable amount of other things. And she took it the way you take a bag of groceries from someone holding too much. Practical. Both hands. Thank you. She didn't raise it over her head. The crowd wasn't sure what to do with that. They applauded anyway, because the match had been extraordinary, because 38 seconds of that quality is its own kind of theater. But there was a moment. She felt it, that shifting, adjusting sound the crowd made, where they wanted something from her face, and her face gave them nothing. The announcer said something into the microphone. She walked back toward her corner. Her coach, a short man named Kwame, who had coached her for the last 6 years and knew better than most people what her silences meant, handed her a water bottle and said nothing. She drank. She breathed. She looked at the middle distance for exactly as long as it took to confirm that what she'd been carrying in her chest for 11 months had not moved, had not resolved, was still sitting there like a stone in a pocket. She said, "Press area?" Kwame said, "Press area." She picked up her bag. She followed the officials down the hall. She walked into the room where the photographers and the journalists and the various people with lanyards and clipboards were already positioned, and she sat down at the table where the belt was supposed to go, and she placed the belt in front of her, and she picked up the orange that someone had left in a bowl at the corner of the table and began to peel it. She didn't know why she picked up the orange. That's not true. She knew exactly why. She just wasn't going to think about it right now. The press room had the good fluorescent lights, not the green ones from the locker room. These ones ran slightly warm, which was either the building trying harder or just luck, and it smelled like coffee and the particular synthetic material that camera bags are made of. There were maybe 30 people in the room, half journalists, the other half a miscellaneous category that included sponsors' representatives, event logistics people, and 2 women with tablets who never spoke but were always writing something. Nadia pulled the first strip of orange peel loose. She had done 3 interviews already in the tournament, one after the first win, one after the second, one that got cut short because the timing ran over. She knew how press rooms worked. Someone asked about her preparation. Someone asked about her opponent. Someone, always someone, asked about how it felt to win, and she would say something true but small, something that fit in the container they were offering her without spilling over the sides, and then it would be over. The photographer at the front of the room took her picture 3 times in quick succession. Flash, flash, flash. She didn't blink. Kwame stood to her left, 2 feet back, arms folded, watching the room. Nadia watched the room too. She had been watching the room since she walked in. Not with her eyes, or not only with her eyes. She watched with the part of her that had spent years in buildings where the geometry of who was standing where carried information she needed. You learn to read rooms when rooms have been dangerous. Not that this room was dangerous. But the habit doesn't ask permission to stay. She saw Dakarai Volta when he was still by the door. He had come in from the left side. He was wearing a suit that fit well, which meant nothing by itself, because plenty of people wore suits to these events. He was carrying a folder, which also meant nothing. But he was moving through the room in a particular way, not toward the press table, not toward any of the sponsors, not making eye contact with anyone who might stop him and ask who he was. The way a person moves when they have already calculated exactly where they are going and have decided to arrive before anyone can ask them to leave. She peeled another strip of orange. She saw Soren Holt when he was on the right side, near the cameras. He had come in from a different door, which was worth noting. He was older than Dakarai, older than Nadia remembered, which meant time had been moving at its usual pace outside the very specific capsule she had been living in. And he was wearing a jacket over a shirt that was slightly too formal for the jacket, the way people dress when they got dressed in a hurry because something urgent came up and they are pretending the urgency is under control. He was not carrying a folder. He was carrying himself the way men carry themselves when they believe they are owed something and have come to collect. She set down the orange peel, picked it back up, kept peeling. They did not know each other. Or rather, Dakarai knew who Soren was, in the way that people on opposite sides of a long-running dispute know each other, which is intensely and impersonally, the way you know the shape of something without ever having touched it. And Soren knew Dakarai by the same cold familiarity. They arrived at her table from opposite sides of the room at almost exactly the same moment. The photographers, who are professionals and therefore alert to the visual drama of 2 men in suits arriving from opposite directions at the same time, took several photographs. Nadia ate a segment of her orange. Dakarai Volta spoke first, because Dakarai Volta was the kind of man who spoke first. He set his folder on the table. He did not sit down. He placed both palms flat on the surface, which was a gesture that meant something to him, probably about authority, and he said, in a voice designed to carry Without quite being loud enough to cause a scene, the prize from this tournament is not hers to keep. The room changed temperature, not literally, but anyone who has been in a room when something unexpected and charged happens knows the sensation. The air shifts, everyone recalibrates. The photographers who were already pointing their cameras at Nadia now pointed them also at Dakarai, and the journalists who had been waiting to ask about preparation and feelings and the angle of the finishing move were now waiting for something much more interesting. Soren Holt, from the right side, said, "I was about to say the same thing." Then they both looked at each other. There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds, but contained a great deal of information. Kwame, from his position 2 feet behind Nadia's left shoulder, said nothing. His expression did not change. He had the particular stillness of a man who had been told certain things in advance and was now waiting to see if those things would unfold in the order they were supposed to. Nadia ate another segment of her orange. The journalist closest to the table, a woman with a recorder held up like a small torch, turned the recorder toward Dakarai and said, "I'm sorry, can you explain what you mean?" Dakarai opened his folder. Inside the folder was a document. Multiple pages, held together with a clip, the pages slightly worn at the edges in the way documents get when they have been taken out and put back many times, when they have been the object of a long argument that never quite resolved. He placed it on the table between himself and Nadia, without sliding it toward either of them. "This is an investment contract," he said. "Signed 7 years ago. It represents financial support provided to the training of this fighter." He said this fighter, the way you say this building or this road, a piece of infrastructure, in exchange for a percentage of all future competitive earnings, including prize money from any tournament in which she places in the top 3. She placed first today. The prize money is $40,000. A portion of that belongs to my client, per the terms of this contract, which was signed by her legal guardian at the time. Her legal guardian. Nadia looked at the document on the table. She looked at it the way you look at something you have seen so many times it has become a texture rather than a thing. Her father had signed it in the kitchen of the apartment they lived in when she was 17. She had not been in the kitchen. She had been in the next room doing her homework. She had heard the sound of men's voices, the particular cadence of an agreement being reached, the small silence at the end that meant pen on paper. She had kept doing her homework. She had not gone in. She peeled the last strip of orange off. Soren Holt, who had been waiting with the controlled tension of a man who has been doing a very long wait, reached inside his jacket and produced his own document. Not a folder, just pages, folded once. He unfolded them and placed them on the table on the other side of the belt. "I have a contract as well," he said. He was looking at Dakarai when he said it. "Training services agreement. 7.5 years ago, also signed by her guardian. It establishes a prior claim on competitive earnings dating to the beginning of her career. If we're doing this here, I'd like it noted that my contract predates yours by 6 months." Dakarai looked at Soren's document. He did not pick it up. Soren looked at Dakarai's document. He did not pick it up either. They both looked at Nadia. She was looking at the orange peel she had dropped on the floor. It is worth explaining what the room thought was happening, because what the room thought was happening and what was actually happening were two different things in the way that a photograph of a place and the place itself are two different things, related, recognizable, but missing the thing that makes it real. What the room thought was happening, 2 powerful men had arrived to contest the earnings of a female fighter, each claiming a legal right to a portion of her prize money, each apparently having some historical financial relationship with her, and the story here was about those 2 men and their competing claims, with Nadia Osei as the object of the dispute, the land being argued over, not the person arguing. The photographers were already composing their images around the men. The journalist with the recorder had turned it toward the documents. A man near the back of the room, one of the ones with a lanyard, had taken out his phone and was typing something, probably to someone outside the room, a summary of events that would arrive in someone's inbox in a form that confirmed what everyone in the room had already decided was happening. Nadia, for her part, had picked up the orange peel from the floor. She wasn't sure why she'd dropped it. Or rather, she knew why she'd dropped it. Her hands had just been doing a thing, the peeling, And when Soren put his document on the table, she had stopped doing the thing, because for one moment the room had become very much the kitchen of the apartment she grew up in, and she had needed a second, 1 second, just one, to be back in it. The linoleum in that kitchen was orange and cream, a pattern of interlocking shapes that she had stared at many times while eating breakfast alone, or while sitting on the counter when her father was cooking, or while standing outside the kitchen doorway listening to things she was not supposed to understand and understanding them anyway. The pattern had a center point, a place where the shapes converged, and if you stared at it long enough it became a kind of static, a blur, a way of making the sounds in the room something that was happening at a distance rather than directly to you. She stared at the orange peel in her hand. Then she put it on the table. The room was still talking. Dakarai was explaining something about the legal force of contracts signed by guardians on behalf of minors. Soren was explaining something about the precedence of prior agreements. A third man, not one of the fighters' representatives, some official person, was trying to intervene, saying that this was not the time or the venue for contract disputes, that there was a formal process. Nadia's leg had fallen asleep. This is a true and undramatic thing that happens to people who sit still for a long time. She had been sitting in the same position since she sat down, which had been several minutes, and the chair was one of those folding chairs with a slight forward tilt that puts pressure on the back of the thigh, and now her left leg from the knee down was doing that familiar horrible business of pins and needles and partial non-existence. She stood up. Not dramatically, not as a statement. She stood up because her leg had fallen asleep, and she needed to stand up, and she transferred her weight onto her right foot and stamped her left once, gently, the way you do when you're trying to be quiet about the fact that your leg has fallen asleep in a room full of people who are all looking at you. The room went quiet, not because of anything she did, just the physics of attention. She had been still for so long that her movement read as significance, the way a bird sitting on a wire reads as decoration, and the same bird launching into the air reads as event. She waited for the pins and needles to pass. Then she walked around the table. She walked to where Dakarai's folder sat. She looked at the document. She picked it up, not grabbing, not snatching, the way you pick up something that is yours to handle. She looked at the first page. Then the second. She put it back down. She walked to where Soren's document sat. She did the same thing. First page, second, third. She paused on the third page longer than the others. Then she put it back down. She walked back around the table. She opened her bag. Inside her bag, under her water bottle and her change of clothes, and the small carved figure her mother had given her when she was 6 years old, and which she had carried to every fight since, was a manila envelope. She had put it in the bag that morning. She had put it in the bag the day before that, and the day before that, going back 11 months, every bag she packed, for every training session, and every preliminary match, and every early morning run, the envelope had been in the bag. She set the envelope on the table. She opened it. Inside were 3 pieces of paper. She put the first one next to Dakarai's document. She put the second one next to Soren's document. She put the third one in the middle, next to the belt. Then she sat back down. The third document was the one that mattered. The first 2 were copies, clean copies, properly certified, of both contracts that Dakarai and Soren had just put on the table. Not the originals. But they matched the originals, page for page, clause for clause, the specific language her father had signed his name underneath. Language that had been negotiated by people who understood that language was a way of building a room that someone else would have to live in. She had known both contracts existed. She had known the details of both for 4 years. She had known which clauses overlapped and which contradicted, and which would, in a dispute between the 2 claimants, cancel each other out rather than compounding. She had known all of this because she had spent 4 years learning it. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way a movie would show it, with scenes of late nights and stacked law books and a mentor figure who explains things across a desk. Just in the ordinary, grinding, specific way that you learn anything you need to know to survive a situation you have been living with for a long time. She had found a lawyer. The lawyer had explained things. She had asked questions. The lawyer had answered. She had taken notes. She had asked more questions. She had done this for months. the legal education running parallel to the training, one happening in gyms and the other happening in a small office above a dry cleaning business on a street she would not visit again. The third document was the conclusion of all of that. It was a voiding agreement. Signed by her, she had been old enough to sign for herself by then, and countersigned by a legal representative, and dated 11 months and 3 days ago. It declared both prior contracts null and void on the grounds of specific procedural failures in the original signing process. Failures that the lawyer had identified, and which Nadia had verified, and which were, when you read them carefully, fairly obvious. The kind of thing that happens when agreements are made quickly and informally by people who trust the weight of their own authority more than they trust the rigor of the paperwork. The voiding agreement had never been contested, not because neither Dakarai nor Soren knew about it. They had both received copies, certified, registered, sent to addresses she had verified. They had known for 11 months that the contracts were void. What they had done with that knowledge was arrive in this room today, with their documents, on the reasonable calculation that most people in Nadia's position, 24 years old, female, just won her first major tournament, standing in front of cameras and journalists, would choose to concede rather than cause a scene. They had made an error in reading the room. Specifically, they had misread the person who was in the room. Dakarai picked up the voiding agreement. He read it. He read it the way lawyers read things, not word by word but in chunks, the eye moving to the clauses that matter, the signature, the date, the counter-signature. His expression did not change. He was good at that, the unchanging expression. She recognized it from the men in the kitchen. He set it down. "This document," he said, "is being contested." "By who?" Nadia said. "By my client." "Your client signed the original agreement with my father, not with me. I was 17. I was not a legal party. Your guardian's signature is covered in Section 3 of the voiding agreement," she said, "which was reviewed by 2 lawyers before filing. If your client wants to contest it, your client can file a formal claim with the relevant body, which is listed on page 2, and we can discuss it there." Dakarai looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his folder. He tucked his document back inside. He clicked the folder shut. He straightened his jacket. He nodded at her once, which was not agreement. It was the acknowledgement of a man who has just discovered the room he walked into was not the room he thought he was walking into, and who is reclassifying the situation without admitting that the reclassification is happening. He left. The room watched him go. The photographer took pictures. Soren had not moved. He was still standing on the right side of the table, with his pages folded in his hand, and he was looking at Nadia in a way that was different from how Dakarai had looked at her. Dakarai's look had been the look of someone assessing an obstacle. Soren's look was something older and more complicated, the look of someone finding in front of them a thing they had thought about for a long time in the abstract, and are now confronting as a physical fact. She looked back at him. She was good at looking at people without explaining what the look meant. Soren Holt had been her first real coach. Not her father, who had taught her to fight the way you teach a child things, which is to say by doing it alongside her and expecting her to follow. Soren had taught her technically. He had understood the geometry of what she could do, and he had spent 2 years building a vocabulary around it. Footwork, weight transfer, the angle that had just ended tonight's final in 38 seconds. He had made her the fighter she was in every way that could be measured, and several that couldn't. He had also been the one to call Dakarai. She had found that out later. Not from Soren, from the documentation, which does not lie in the way people lie. The dates, the communications, the timing. Soren had introduced her father to Dakarai's client. Soren had been the reason the first contract existed. And Soren had, 8 years ago, signed his own agreement with her father. The prior claim, the one that predated the investment contract by 6 months, which had created the situation where 2 contracts existed that could not both be honored, which meant that in any dispute, neither would be. She did not know if he had planned that. She had decided not to spend much time trying to find out. Soren said her name, just her name, the way people say the name of someone they taught, when the person they taught has become something beyond what they imagined in the teaching. She looked at him. One breath. She picked up the belt from the table. She put it over her shoulder. She tucked her voiding agreement back into the manila envelope. She put the envelope back in her bag. She walked to the door. At the door, Kwame was waiting. He had been waiting there for most of the last several minutes, positioned precisely between her and the rest of the room, in the way that coaches stand when they are not needed, but want it understood that they are present. She walked past him and he fell into step beside her, and they walked down the hall together, and the fluorescent lights above them were the warm ones here too, and the sound of the crowd had died down to the particular low noise of 3,000 people finding their coats and thinking about where they were going to eat. She said nothing, he said nothing. At the end of the hall there was a fire door that opened onto the street at the side of the building, and she pushed it open and the evening came in. It was the early kind of evening that arrives in the particular season between late summer and actual autumn, when the air is cool without being cold, and the light sits lower than you expect, and everything has that quality of things being done for the day, of a kind of closing. She sat down on the curb. She put the belt beside her on the concrete. A city bus went past on the street ahead of her. One of the long ones, articulated in the middle, moving with the slow authority of something that has been making this journey for long enough that it no longer thinks about it. It went past, and the air moved in its wake, and then it was gone. She looked at where it had been. Behind her, inside the building, there were still cameras and clipboards and lanyard people and journalists, and somewhere in there, Soren Holt was still standing at a table with his folded pages, and somewhere, Dakarai Volta was recalculating in an elevator, and the belt was heavy and slightly cold on the concrete beside her, and the evening was doing what evenings do. Her phone was in her bag. She did not take it out. She peeled a thread of orange from her thumbnail. She had gotten the peel under there at some point, lodged in the small crescent space, and flicked it off. She thought about the kitchen, not the bad version, the one with the voices and the agreements. The other version, earlier, the version with the morning light coming in through the window above the sink, hitting the orange and cream linoleum in a way that made the colors brighter than they really were. Her father making eggs, the sound of the pan, the smell of the tape on her hands from training the night before, because she always left the tape on too long, because she liked the feeling of her hands being wrapped, the solid held-together feeling of it, the sense of preparation for something that hadn't happened yet. She had been 9, 10, somewhere in there. The kitchen had been small. The eggs had been good. She thought about this for a while. Then she picked up the belt. She looked at it, really looked at it, the excessive gold, the engraving, her name on it, in letters that were too large and slightly italic, the way the light from the street caught the surface. It was a ridiculous object. She had wanted it for 3 years, and now that she had it, it looked like something a child would design when asked to imagine what winning looked like. She thought, I'll probably like it more tomorrow. She stood up. The pins and needles were gone, both legs, entirely her own again. She picked up the belt and her bag, and she walked to the corner where the bus stopped. She thought about what came next, not the immediate next, the hotel, the flight home, the phone calls she would return in the morning, the other next, the longer one. She had built the last 4 years around this specific day, this specific room, these specific documents, this specific conclusion. Now the day had arrived and concluded, and the documents were in her bag, and the belt was over her shoulder, and the thing she had been carrying in her chest for 11 months, that stone, that pressed weight, was still there. She did not think it would leave quickly. That was all right. She had always been patient with the things that did not leave quickly. The bus appeared at the far end of the street, the long articulated one again, making its next circuit, its headlights not yet needed in this light, but on anyway, the way things are sometimes prepared for a darkness that hasn't arrived yet. She let it go past. She would catch the next one. She had already written the next chapter. She just hadn't decided when to let anyone else read it.